Number 1. One particular instance stands out the most as the most unnerving thing that I've experienced. It's one thing to see a warning sign about a predator in the area, and it's another thing to be stalked all day. I went out one afternoon on my small jong boat to do some fishing in a swamp, mainly for warmouth. I was pretty familiar with the area and motored about 3 to 4 miles to reach my favourite spot. Alligators are fairly commonplace out there, and it's just something you become accustomed to. Generally, if you respect them, they'll respect you, as they've become pretty used to fishermen. The water in the swamps are full of tannic acid from the decaying leaves on the bottom, so the water looks inky black at first, and visibility is only a few inches. Anything that is visible just under the surface is tinted a dark amber colour. I had caught a few fish and noticed that around 50 to 60 yards back up the canal, a pair of eyes were floating just above the water and pointing in my direction. It was a gator, no big deal. They've learned to become more opportunistic and steal stringers of fish if you leave them hanging from the side of boats. I continued fishing for a few minutes and had just reached down over the side of the boat to grab the lip of a warmouth that I'd hooked. As I pulled the fish out, I saw the faintest glint of amber in the water, about a foot below where my hand had just been. I watched as the faint glint slowly rose upwards towards the surface of the water, revealing 2 black eyes and the largest jaw on a gator that I've ever seen in the wild. I slid back into the center of my small john boat as the head of the gator broke the surface. I could feel its back sliding along the bottom of my boat, shifting it slightly. After watching it for 10 to 15 seconds, it finally swam out from under the boat. I'm guessing it was pushing 12 to 13 feet, and that's after having seen hundreds of gators. This gator followed me for the rest of the day. I'd always motor a bit further away just to put distance between us, but not long after I'd stop, I'd feel that familiar bump on the bottom of the boat again. Each time, it would eventually just swim off a few feet and turn to stare at me. I've never felt more outmatched. This dark, quiet, toothy bastard had the ability to sneak up at you at any time it pleased and get within 3 feet of you before you even knew it was there. Do you know how unnerving it is to look at something in the eye that makes it abundantly clear that it's only waiting for you to make a mistake? There's a level of intelligence and focus in those eyes that makes you understand your place in the food chain. It's not the first time gators have followed me. I've been followed by 3 at once before, but none have ever made me so intimately aware that the only thing on its mind was to drag me out of my boat and under the surface of that black water. Number 2. In the early to mid-90s when I was a teenager, I used to spend all my free time out in the woods, often alone, but sometimes in the summer. My buddy and I would carry my small canoe through the trails we made, over a mile to a somewhat remote lake. There was a small dirt road that went by the lake, and a house on the far side. The only place for us to launch my canoe was a small opening in the woods by an old collapsed duck blind. We made this trip a dozen times each summer as teenagers to go fishing. We would use the collapsed duck blind as a makeshift dock, walking across it to climb into and launch the canoe. Around this same time, at a golf course around 3 miles away from my parents' house, a woman just showed up and disappeared one night, leaving her car parked at the clubhouse with no signal of foul play. The winter after she went missing, we went out ice fishing in the middle of the lake. Right as the sun set, A vehicle pulled into the turnaround overlooking the lake about 200 yards away, headlights panning across the lake to us. The vehicle just sat there watching us for 15 minutes and left. We thought this was a little strange, as it's a pretty rural area and random cars don't really come and park there. We fished until late and then went home. Nothing else eventful happened. The next spring, as soon as the lake ice was gone, we went with my canoe again, bouncing on the duck blind, using it as a makeshift urinal being teenagers. And this time, we noticed a foul odour at the duck blind and joked that the hunter was dead underneath it. We never thought about it twice. Out in the woods or by the lake once in a great while, you'd come across a dead animal, so we never thought anything. That summer, I moved away from the area. A few years after I moved away, my dad called me to tell me that the missing girl had been found dead. She had been kidnapped, raped, murdered and buried under a duck blind at the edge of the lake we always fished at. She had been right under that duck blind for almost a year by the time they found her. All the time we were just out there fishing, totally unaware that she was right there. I called my buddy, and he reminded me of the weird car watching us whilst we were out ice fishing in the winter. We wonder if it was the guy just coming back to check the spot that he'd dumped the body the previous summer. Thankfully, the killer was caught and put in prison shortly after. Number 3. My cousin and I were fishing late at night. We decided to go around 9 PM, since that's when it's the best time for us to go and get a bite. We got to our spot and there was nothing but the two of us, the lake, and your normal chirp chirp of some other random animal sounds, which we were used to. Around 30 minutes into our peaceful night of fishing, suddenly things went quiet. If you've ever gone to our spot, you know that this just doesn't happen. We didn't say anything and we kept on with our night. But suddenly, there was a loud screaming sound coming from behind us. I turned to look at my cousin, but this time his face was pale, and we asked out loud at the same time, "Did you hear that?" "Yes, I did." "What was it?" "I don't know, I've never heard that before," he said. As much as we both tried to ignore it, we kept alert, but then it passed, and after about an hour or so we'd forgotten about the incident completely. We didn't catch much, so we decided to pack up and call it a night. When we were heading back to our truck, we started hearing leaves rustling behind us. We turned around thinking it was an animal, but nothing was there. We kept on, and right as we were about to hop into our truck, a woman appeared right in front of us, at least a few feet away. She looked dirty and a little beat up with some blood stains on what seemed to be a nightgown. We shouted, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She just continued to stare at us, and then made the same shrieking scream that we'd heard before. My cousin and I were petrified and got into our car and drove off. We haven't been back to our fishing spot ever since, and we never told anyone what happened, but I can still hear that scream in my mind if I think about it hard enough. Number 4. My two buddies from the war and I go about twice a year on a weekend-long fishing trip. We catch up on our lives, rent a cabin and the usual. But this year happened to be one when my buddies were sick, so I told my other friend about it, and he told me that his cousin was in town and that he could fill in. So we took off to our spot. Once we got there it was late in the afternoon, but we had enough time to set up our gear and head down to the boondocks. Among some of the things that we took with us, there was a weather/emergency radio, just in case of an emergency. We set it up on any FM frequencies, and chill out until we catch something. Between us talking and getting to know more about my friend's cousin, the radio started to make a crackling sound which it had never done before. Then the radio mysteriously switched from FM to AM, which I thought was weird since it had a little button on the side that you needed to press in order for it to change. We called it a night. But my friend's cousin looked distracted. He kept looking at the lake and smiling, and there was also a hint of fear in his eyes. When we got to the cabin, we headed towards the kitchen because we all heard a loud noise. All the dishes had been thrown onto the floor, and my radio was making the same strange sound. My buddy's cousin comes up and tells me, "Don't worry, it's the spirit of the man who lives here. He just doesn't like you guys coming here." I looked at him puzzled, and my friend later explained to me that he's a medium. I wasn't much of a believer, but now things have changed. Number 5. Back in the colonial days, there were people called wreckers. They would stand on beaches with lanterns and trick ships into running aground, and then loot the ship and kill anyone who survived on the beach. They then drag the bodies into the water to make it look like an ordinary shipwreck. Well, one night on an east beach in Rhode Island, I was fishing with my father. As we got down to the beach, we saw some odd drag marks in the sand. After about an hour and a half of casting, we made our way back to the truck. As we hit the parking lot, our German Shepherd began acting really weird. We were loading up the truck with our gear when we saw a light coming out from the dunes. As we got a good look, we saw it was an old 17th or 18th century lantern. When we saw 2 more lights and 4 people walked out wearing colonial clothes. Our hearts pretty much stopped beating at that point. We threw everything into the truck, piling in on our growling dog, and blasted out of there. As we pulled out, our lights went right over the people, and we saw them clearly. They were wearing ratty colonial style clothes, and it really freaked us out. Never went fishing there again at night. Number 6. Only once when I was fishing did I have a ghostly experience, and that was when I was fishing at a lake in France. I'd been there for a couple of days, and my time was really nice and peaceful. There was an old chateau nearby riddled with bullet holes from the Second World War. Anyway, this lake is on a French army training area, so it was pretty secluded, and during the late afternoons, I had the feeling of being watched from the woods on the far end of the lake. Each day at the same time, the feeling would return, usually around dusk and from different areas as whatever it was got closer. I remember walking on the last night of my trip, outside the bivvy. It was very foggy, and I could hardly see the dim glow of my bite alarms. I decided to make a brew. As I flicked on the lighter, the sparks silhouetted the face of a helmeted German soldier, peering into my bivvy from the darkness outside. The next morning I packed up and went home, but not before speaking to an old French estate warden, who told me that the chateau had seen some fierce fighting when the Americans liberated that area of France. The Germans had fled into the woods, only to be ambushed by a patrol in reserve. They were all killed and buried around the lake. I don't think I'll fish there again. Number 7. My buddy and I were fishing at a certain fort in Jamestown. At one point, my buddy decided to walk to the boat dock around 50 yards away. The whole walk there, he said that he sensed someone behind him and heard footsteps. He thought I was walking with him, but when he turned around, he was alone. He said it creeped him out pretty bad, and he never went back to that spot with me. Now fast forward to next summer. I decided to fish this spot by myself. I had completely forgotten about my friend's experience. I got to the dock and unloaded everything and started to soak some bait. It was a clear moonless night with no wind nor breeze. About a half hour into watching my rod, I started to smell perfume around me. I thought it was pretty weird since I was the only person out there. The smell kept getting stronger and stronger, so I walked about 10 feet to my right and the smell disappeared. Then I walked back to my original spot and the perfume smell was still there, stronger than ever. It was so strong to the point that my nose started to feel burn. At that point, I said, "Where the hell is this smell coming from?" And soon after I said that, the smell disappeared. That's when I packed up and left, and I have not been back to that fishing spot ever since.